I was standing in the back of a tailor shop, hidden behind a curtain of hanging suit jackets, when I heard my wife laugh about managing my exit. Not asking for it, not suggesting it, managing it. The word floated through the thin partition wall like it had been rehearsed 100 times before she finally said it out loud. Everything is already structured, she said. Once the board accepts the transition plan, it moves automatically. Another voice answered, younger, smoother. A voice I recognized from too many dinners where I had poured the wine and told the stories while he sat across from me and smiled. He won't fight it, that voice said. Not once the medical documentation is filed. My wife again, quieter now. He just needs to believe it's still his idea. I pressed my back against the wall of that narrow corridor and listened to 31 years of marriage rearrange itself into something I barely recognized. The Hargrove Foundation Gala was 3 days away. I had built that foundation over 2 decades, named it after the surgeon who trained me, funded it from my own savings when the hospital board told me the vision was too ambitious. We provided surgical training to underserved communities across 6 states. We had placed residents in clinics from rural Montana to South Georgia. My name was on the letterhead, but more than that, my life was inside those walls. And I had come to Henry's shop that Tuesday afternoon simply to pick up a suit. Henry Song had been tailoring my clothes for 19 years. He was a small, careful man in his late 60s who moved around his shop with the quiet efficiency of someone who believed that doing one thing perfectly was worth more than doing 10 things adequately. He had fitted my suits for board dinners, for my daughter's wedding, for my wife's sister's funeral. He knew my measurements better than I did. When I stepped through the door that afternoon, the shop was quieter than usual. No music, no hum from the pressing machine in the back. Henry came around the counter quickly, his expression tighter than I'd ever seen it, and he took my arm the way you take someone's arm when they're about to step into traffic. "Come with me," he said, barely above a whisper. I laughed. I thought perhaps he had a surprise alteration, something special for the gala. Henry sometimes did that, added a pocket square he'd chosen himself, a small flourish he never charged for. But he didn't smile. He guided me past the racks of wool and linen and pushed open the door to his back workroom, the narrow space where he cut fabric and kept his ironing equipment and stacked his reference books on textile care. "Stay here," he said. "Don't make a sound. I need you to hear something before you walk out that door." "Henry, what is this about?" He shook his head once. "Trust me, please. Just listen." He pulled the door most of the way closed and disappeared. I stood between a cutting table and a rack of unfinished garments, feeling the particular embarrassment of a man in his 60s hiding in a tailor's workroom on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost opened the door and walked out. My hand was on the handle. Then I heard the front bell and my wife's voice. "It's ready?" she asked. "Almost," Henry said. "Let me check the hem." Footsteps, the sound of a garment bag unzipping. Then a third voice, and my hand went still. Daniel Ashworth, 39 years old. My wife had introduced him to the foundation 16 months ago as a strategic development consultant, someone who could bring the organization into alignment with modern philanthropic models. She had framed it as a gift to me. "You've built something remarkable," she had said. "He can help it outlive us both." He had been attentive, thorough, organized. He had redesigned the foundation's financial reporting structure. He had proposed a revised governance model with an expanded board. He had recommended establishing a new executive committee with independent authority over major capital decisions. I had approved all of it because my wife supported it and because the changes seemed reasonable on the surface. I had not read closely enough. "The power of attorney provision is ready for notarization," Daniel said in the workroom. I heard fabric rustling, the sound of someone settling into the consultation chair near the fitting mirror. Once it's executed, the transition clause in the new bylaws becomes active. My wife's voice was measured. "And the certification from Dr. Calloway? He's prepared the supporting documentation. The episode last year gives us a clinical foundation. He won't be able to dispute it without an independent evaluation, and by the time he arranges one, the board vote will be concluded." I had fainted briefly at a foundation luncheon 11 months ago. One moment I was standing at the head of the table. The next I was on the floor, with my wife's hand on my face and a circle of concerned colleagues above me. The hospital found no serious cause. Vasovagal syncope, they said. Dehydration, heat, stress. My wife had been shaken and had arranged an appointment with a neurologist named Calloway, describing him as one of the most respected in his field. He'd run a battery of tests. He'd asked me to recall sequences of numbers, to trace patterns, to discuss my sleep and my diet and my stress level. I had found the process thorough but not alarming. My wife had sat beside me for every appointment, her hand in mine, her expression attentive. I thought she was frightened for me. He's been resistant to the transition timeline, my wife said now. I pushed too hard last spring and he pulled back completely. He thinks stepping back means disappearing. Daniel paused. That's why the documentation matters. It doesn't require his agreement. It creates a framework the board will accept as duty of care. The word duty sat in my chest like a stone. And the new director position? My wife asked. Appointed by the executive committee, he answered. Once the bylaws are in effect, the committee selects executive leadership independently. The nomination is already prepared. My wife said something I didn't catch. Then Daniel said more clearly, the gala is the right moment. He'll be surrounded by supporters. It won't read as a removal. It'll read as a celebration. A graceful passing of the torch. Passing of the torch. My torch, passed by people who had decided my hands were no longer steady enough to hold it. I heard my wife exhale slowly. I just want it finished cleanly. I know, he said. And it will be. Henry appeared at the workroom door a few minutes later, eyes averted. They were leaving, he said quietly. He held the door open, and I stepped out into the main shop. How long have you known? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. They've been coming in together for 2 months. She always picks up your alterations while he's here. I thought it was coincidence the first time. He folded his hands on the counter. Last week I heard them mention the gala. I heard the word documentation. I heard her say he can't stop it if he doesn't know. I looked at my suit hanging in its garment bag. Dark charcoal. I had chosen it for the gala specifically. For the night the foundation was giving me a lifetime achievement recognition. My lifetime achievement, presented at the moment they intended to remove me from everything I had built. I picked up the bag. Thank you, Henry, I said. He nodded once. He didn't ask questions. That was one of the things I had always valued about him. The drive home took 20 minutes. I do not remember most of it. I remember the light at the intersection near the pharmacy being red for what felt like an unusually long time. I remember the radio playing something. I turned off immediately. I remember my own hands on the steering wheel, steady. That surprised me. I expected them to shake. By the time I pulled into the driveway, something had organized itself in my mind. Not rage, not despair. Clarity, arriving quietly, the way it sometimes does after a long and difficult surgery, when you finally understand exactly what is in front of you. If I walked inside and confronted my wife, she would reframe it. Daniel would describe it as a misunderstanding. Dr. Calloway would offer clinical language I couldn't immediately disprove. And I would become the agitated older man who overreacted to something that was only meant to protect him. That narrative was already written. I had heard the rough draft of it in Henry's back room. I needed evidence, not suspicion, evidence. My wife was in the kitchen when I came in, reviewing a printed seating chart for the gala. She looked up and smiled. How did it fit? She asked. Perfectly, I said. Henry does good work. She nodded and returned to the seating chart. She asked whether I'd confirmed the audio setup for the evening's program. I told her I had. She mentioned that Daniel would be seated at the head table and asked whether I minded. Of course not, I said. He's been a valuable part of the team. She looked at me briefly. Something behind her eyes measured my tone. I gave her nothing to read. I went to my study and closed the door. The next morning I called Frank DeLuca. I had met Frank once at a hospital board meeting, years earlier. He had been brought in to investigate a billing irregularity and had resolved it in 2 weeks without any public noise. He operated a private investigative firm out of an office in a building that looked like it sold insurance. He had the demeanor of a man who had seen most things and judged very few of them. I told him what I needed: financial tracing, corporate filings, any documentation tied to the foundation's new governance structure, and anyone involved in preparing it. How quickly? He asked. The gala is in 3 days, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll start this afternoon. I returned home and spent the next 3 days behaving exactly as I had for 31 years. I asked about the centerpiece arrangements. I reviewed the printed program. I called the caterer about a dietary request from one of our major donors. I sat across from my wife at the dinner table and spoke about the foundation's work in Tennessee, about a young resident we had sponsored who had just performed his first independent procedure. My wife listened with the warmth she had always brought to conversations about the foundation. She asked thoughtful questions. She had always been good at that. I watched her and thought about what she had said in Henry's workroom. I just want it finished cleanly. I turned the sentence over in my mind each night while she slept beside me. Frank called on the second afternoon. There's a holding entity, he said. Registered 6 weeks ago. Whitmore Bridge Consulting. Managing partners are listed as Daniel Ashworth and a Margaret, your wife. I stepped out to the back porch and lowered my voice. What is it structured to do? Receive management fees from a consulting arrangement with the foundation. The arrangement was drafted into the executive committee's proposed operating agreement. Once the committee takes authority, they approve the consulting contract. The fees flow to Whitmore Bridge, and the value of those fees? Frank paused. First-year projection is $480,000. I sat down in the porch chair. There's more, he continued. Dr. Calloway was retained as a medical consultant by Whitmore Bridge 3 months ago. Flat retainer. No documented services. I need it all in writing, I said. You'll have it tonight. That evening, my wife brought a glass of wine to my study and sat across from me. She had done this hundreds of times. It was one of our routines, the end of the day, a quiet debrief. I used to look forward to it. You seem distant this week, she said. Pre-event nerves, I told her. You know how I get before a big night. She studied me. You've been working in here a lot. Going through some old program documents. Nostalgia, I suppose. With the lifetime recognition and everything. She smiled. You deserve it. Everything you've built. The words arrived cleanly, without apparent irony. I nodded and sipped my wine. The next morning, Frank's report arrived. I read it at my desk, printed it, and locked the pages in the bottom drawer. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my personal attorney. The second was to the 2 founding board members who had been with the Hargrove Foundation since the beginning, both of whom I had known for over 20 years. The third was to Thomas, my son, who was flying in that evening for the gala. When Thomas arrived, I met him alone on the back porch while my wife was upstairs dressing for the dinner. I need you to know some things before tonight, I said. He listened without interrupting. He had always been that way, measured in the way he received information, not rushing toward conclusions. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Does Jenna know? He asked. Not yet. I didn't want to do this over the phone. He looked at the darkening lake beyond the yard. What do you need me to do tonight? Be present, I said. And don't react until I've finished. He nodded once. That was enough. The gala was held at the Foundation's Event Center, a converted mill building on the edge of town that we had renovated 12 years earlier, with a matching grant and a lot of weekends. High ceilings, exposed beams, long tables dressed in white linen, the kind of room that made people feel they were part of something larger than themselves. I had stood in that room at least 40 times. I knew every corner of it. 300 guests arrived across the early evening. Foundation donors, medical colleagues, community partners, former residents we had trained, local officials who had supported our work over the years. My daughter Jenna found me near the entrance and hugged me long enough that I thought she somehow already knew. She didn't. She was just proud. I had never felt more alone in a room full of people who loved me. Daniel arrived in a gray suit, unhurried, composed. He shook my hand with both of his, the grip of a man who had decided the outcome in advance. Tonight is well-deserved, he said warmly. Thank you, Daniel, I replied. I meant to ask you, how is the revised operating agreement coming along? He smiled, a half-second delay I would not have noticed a year ago. Almost finalized. We'll have it ready for signatures next week. I nodded slowly. I'd like to review the Whitmore Bridge arrangement specifically, I said. I understand there's a consulting structure attached to the executive committee's authority. His smile held, but his eyes recalibrated. Of course. We can walk through it at your convenience. I'd like to walk through it tonight, I said, after my remarks. Something moved behind his expression. Certainly, he said. Of course. I found Frank near the back of the room, standing beside one of the Foundation's longtime administrative staff. He gave me a single nod. Everything was ready. My wife came to me just before the program began. She took my arm and leaned close. I'm proud of you, she said softly. Everything you've built here. I looked at her for a moment. I genuinely could not tell even then whether she believed what she was saying. Thank you, I said. The program moved through its early portions without incident. Remarks from 2 board members, a video tribute, a check presentation from a donor who had funded a new simulation lab in Mississippi. My wife watched from her seat at the head table with the attentive grace she brought to every public occasion. When they called my name, I stood and walked to the podium. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms do when they are about to applaud. People smiled up at me, expectant, generous. I saw faces I had worked beside for 20 years. People who had believed in this mission long before it was successful. People who had written personal checks and driven long distances and vouched for us when we were still trying to prove what we could be. I had prepared for this moment differently than anyone in that room expected. I want to begin, I said, by thanking all of you for 31 years of your trust. Not just your financial support, your trust. Your willingness to believe that what we were building here mattered. Applause. I waited for it to settle. Trust, I continued, is the operating principle of everything in this room. It is why donors give. It is why residents train with us. It is why our partners open their communities to us. Without trust, we have nothing. I paused. 3 days ago, I learned that the trust at the heart of this foundation was being used as architecture for its transfer. The room stilled. I want to be precise, because precision matters here, and I have spent my career learning the cost of imprecision. I gestured toward the projection screen at the side of the room, where Frank's assistant had cued the first document. 6 weeks ago, an entity called Whitmore Bridge Consulting was registered as a limited liability company. The managing partners are Daniel Ashworth and my wife. A murmur moved through the tables. My wife's posture changed, barely perceptible, but I had known her posture for 31 years. The next document appeared. The proposed Executive Committee Operating Agreement, specifically the clause authorizing independent management contracts without board approval, and the consulting arrangement attached to it, directing $480,000 in annual fees to Whitmore Bridge upon activation. Daniel stood. This is a misrepresentation of a standard governance modernization process. I turned to face him calmly. The third document appeared on the screen. Dr. Calloway's retainer agreement with Whitmore Bridge, dated 3 months before the neurological evaluation he performed on me. A neurological evaluation, I said evenly, that was used to prepare medical documentation describing me as a candidate for diminished decision-making authority. Silence. My wife's voice came from the head table, quiet and controlled. You were having memory lapses. You fainted. I was afraid. I looked at her directly. You could have told me that. I did tell you, she said. You brushed it off. You could have asked our doctor together. You could have asked our children. You could have said you were frightened of what you thought you saw and asked me to listen. Instead, you formed an LLC and arranged for my physician to be on retainer before he evaluated me. The room was absolutely silent. Someone near the back shifted in their chair. My daughter's voice from halfway across the room, shaking. Mom, is this true? My wife didn't answer. I pulled a document from my jacket. 2 weeks ago, I said, I had an independent neurological evaluation performed by Dr. Eleanor Marsh at the University Medical Center. Her findings are available to anyone who would like to see them. The conclusion is unambiguous. No cognitive impairment, no early indicators of dementia, mild fatigue, consistent with sustained professional activity and stress. Routine for a man my age who keeps the schedule I keep. Dr. Calloway stood abruptly. The evaluation I conducted was entirely based on observed clinical indicators. Observed clinical indicators you were paid to document before the observation, I replied. The retainer date is in the document. It precedes our first appointment by 11 weeks. He sat back down. I'm not pressing charges tonight, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here for vengeance. I'm standing here because 300 people in this room have invested in this foundation and deserve to know what was being built around it. I set the document down on the podium. The board members I've spoken with, both founding members, have reviewed the materials and have filed a petition to void the proposed operating agreement in its entirety. The executive committee structure will be reviewed by an independent governance consultant before any further vote is taken. And any consulting arrangement connected to current or former leadership will require full board disclosure and approval. I looked out at the room. This foundation was built on the belief that medicine, at its best, is an act of service, that you show up for people not because they can offer you something in return, but because they are in front of you and they need what you have. I have tried to live by that for 40 years. I intend to continue trying. I stepped back from the podium. The applause, when it came, was not the kind that fills a room uniformly. It rose unevenly, from different corners, from people who were still deciding what they had witnessed. But it rose. The rest of the evening moved the way evenings do after something irrevocable happens. Guests gathered in quiet clusters. The caterers continued to work. Someone refilled wine glasses. Thomas stayed close to me without hovering. Jenna found her mother and spoke to her in a low, intent voice near the side exit. Their faces turned away from the room. Daniel left early. He collected his jacket from the coat check with the efficiency of a man executing a practiced exit, and I did not watch him go. Frank appeared at my elbow as the room began to thin. "Board attorney has the documentation," he said. "If Whitmore Bridge attempts any further financial activity tied to the foundation, you're fully protected." He paused. "You held up." I felt less like someone who had held up and more like someone who had simply not fallen down. Those can look the same from the outside. My wife found me near the door as the last guests were saying their goodbyes. She had been crying. I could see it in the way she held her face, the careful composure of a woman who had cried and then decided not to anymore. "You planned all of it," she said, "the whole evening." "Yes," I replied. She nodded slowly, looking at the floor. "When did you know?" "3 days ago," I said. "Henry's shop." She closed her eyes briefly. "I thought he would stay out of it." "He has known me for 19 years, I said. "He knows what loyalty looks like." She was quiet for a long time. The cleanup crew moved around us, folding tablecloths, stacking chairs. The anniversary banner still hung across the far wall, the foundation's mission statement in clean blue letters. "I never wanted you to disappear," she said finally. "I wanted you to be protected." "From what?" I asked. "From yourself," she said softly. "From the version of you that doesn't know when to let go." She met my eyes. "Your father kept practicing for 2 years after he should have stopped. You were there. You watched it happen, and you never saw yourself in it." I thought of my father in his 70s, still in the operating room, still insisting, while the people around him managed their concern in whispers. I had watched that. She was right about that. "And you decided the solution was to remove my name from my own work?" I asked. She didn't answer. "I would have listened," I said. "If you had come to me honestly, without a consulting agreement and a paid physician, I would have listened. I may not have agreed, but I would have listened." She nodded once. She looked like she believed me, and I think she did, and I think that was the worst part of it for her. The drive home was quiet. We sat in the kitchen for a while, not speaking much, the house settling around us the way houses do late at night. Thomas had offered to stay. I had told him to go to his hotel and sleep. My wife went upstairs first. I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That is not how the real unraveling of a long life goes. There were attorneys. There were careful, measured conversations with our children, first separately and then together in the living room, on a Sunday afternoon when the light came through the windows, at that particular angle that made everything look more hopeful than it felt. There was a moment when Jenna cried, and I held her and said I was sorry she had to carry any of this, and she said she was sorry too, and neither of us was apologizing to the other exactly. Thomas was steady in the way he has always been steady, and I was grateful for it every single day. Daniel Ashworth resigned his consulting position the morning after the gala, preempting a formal termination vote by approximately 4 hours. The proposed operating agreement was withdrawn. Whitmore Bridge Consulting was dissolved within 3 weeks under the combined weight of the board's inquiry and a quiet review by the state attorney general's office, which had received, through proper channels, a copy of Frank's documentation. Dr. Calloway faced a licensing review and ultimately agreed to a period of supervised practice. There were no criminal charges. There were consequences, which is a different thing, and sometimes a sufficient one. My wife and I separated in November, not with hostility, with the particular exhaustion of two people who have recognized that the marriage they thought they had was built on a shared silence they could no longer sustain. She moved to her sister's place in Asheville. We spoke by phone every few weeks. The conversations were civil and occasionally almost warm, the way conversations are between people who once knew each other completely and now know each other in the attenuated way of people navigating mutual loss. I had the independent evaluation results framed and put in a drawer, not to preserve them, just because I didn't want to throw them away. There is something about holding the paperwork that says you are who you thought you were, something that becomes necessary to have touched, even if you never look at it again. I kept running the foundation. I brought in 2 new board members, both of them people I had known for decades, people whose counsel I trusted. I hired a governance consultant who had no relationship with anyone in my professional circle. We rewrote the operating framework from scratch, and this time I read every line myself. And when I didn't understand something, I asked until I did. In February, I flew to Tennessee to observe a surgical skills workshop we had funded in a community hospital in a county with 1 practicing surgeon for every 8,000 residents. I stood in the back of a converted conference room and watched a 28-year-old resident move through a simulated procedure with the careful focus of someone learning something that would save lives for the next 40 years. The attending instructor caught my eye at one point and nodded, the particular nod of one physician to another across a room, and I felt something that had been compressed for a long time open slightly in my chest. My father stayed in the operating room 2 years longer than he should have. That is true. I watched it happen, and I carried it as a private weight for longer than I admitted to anyone, including myself. I understood why my wife had seen that parallel. I understood why it frightened her. I did not understand why her fear had become authorization. There is a version of this story where the fear is the story, where what happened is simply what fear does when it isn't spoken out loud, when it turns from feeling into process, from worry into strategy, from the desire to protect someone into the mechanics of containing them. I have spent a year thinking about that version. I have more sympathy for it than I expected to. But there is also a version of this story where I sat in a tailor's back room and listened to my future being arranged for me and chose not to accept the arrangement. That version is also true. I am 63 years old. I am not diminished. I am not done. And I am not something to be managed quietly toward an exit that someone else designed. I have mornings now when I sit on the back porch with coffee and watch the light move across the yard, and there is a quality to that stillness that I would not have understood 2 years ago. It is not peace exactly. It is something more honest than peace. It is the particular wakefulness of a person who nearly accepted someone else's version of himself and chose instead to remain the author of his own. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt yourself being quietly shaped toward a smaller version of what you know yourself to be, I want you to hear this clearly. Ask the questions. Read the documents. Find the people who have known you long enough to see you clearly and trust what they tell you. Your confusion is not evidence of decline. Your resistance is not proof of instability. And your refusal to disappear quietly is not drama. It is dignity. Stay with us. There are more mornings ahead, and none of them belong to anyone but you.